Hello, Professor Dyer here, talking about research in human development and family science. So we've talked about randomized controlled trials and high-quality quasi-experimental designs used to try to determine cause. What about the lower quality quasi-experimental designs? Why would anyone use them? What are they used for? What can we learn from them? Remember, there are three determinants of causality. The first is correlation. The problem with quasi-experimental designs that don't even have a control group, so they study only a single group, is that correlation cannot be determined. The second determinant of cause is establishing the temporal order. Some quasi-experimental designs with a single group can do this if they have a pretest. If they don't have a pretest, they can't even do this one. And then the third one, which is the most difficult one, ruling out alternative explanations. Quasi-experimental designs with a single group have no chance of ever doing that. So they're significantly weaker in internal validity than the other experimental designs we've talked about so far. Let's look at two kinds of quasi-experimental designs that use a single group. One is a single group with post-test only. This is when some kind of intervention has been applied and the scientists simply come in later and measure outcomes. They find out what happened afterwards. The problem, of course, is that we don't know anything about the subject before the intervention. Think about surveys that you might take at the end of a doctor's visit or a hospital stay. Surveys you might take after you have a shopping experience in a particular store or on a particular website, or even student ratings of instruction that you complete at the end of completing a course at a university. These are all single group post-test only. They cannot determine cause at all because they don't meet any of the three determinants for cause. What they can do, however, is tell us something about the process. So when you complete the survey, when you leave the hospital, we don't really know, we can't use that information to find out if it's a good hospital or a bad hospital, but the hospital can certainly get information about what they did that you liked and what they did that you thought was problematic. Same with student ratings of instruction at the end of a semester. So they can give information about process and about how that process was perceived, but they really can't say anything about cause. To share an example from HDFS, we turn to Judith Wallerstein's very famous Children of Divorce study. She conceptualized parental divorce as an intervention, and she wanted to know about the outcome of children's emotional well-being as a result of experiencing parental divorce. She did this starting in 1970. California had just become the first state to allow no-fault divorce, and so divorce rates were rising here. And that is when she launched this study. She had a sample of, you can see, over 100 kids whose parents had divorced, and in Marin County in Northern California. They were all middle to upper class, and they were all families who had been referred for therapy. And I point that out because we can infer that there is some selection bias here for kids who are already struggling, families that are already struggling. She didn't do any pretests, so we don't know really what was going on before the divorce. She didn't know who they were until after the divorce was well underway. But there is some suggestion here that these kids were kind of troubled to start with. The amazing thing about the study is that she followed those kids for 25 years. When she met with them, and she met with them every 5 years, she administered questionnaires, and she also conducted in-depth interviews with them. It's a single group, post-test only. There are actually multiple post-tests. So her data, this is a snapshot of one of the papers she published. They're telling us essentially just what percentage of those kids said each one of these things. 73% of them said, I would be a different person today if my parents had not divorced. Or 65% said my life would be different if my parents were together. I had a harder childhood than most, endorsed by almost half. My childhood was cut short, endorsed by 34%. So these numbers are very interesting. They tell us something about the subjective lived experiences of wealthy children in Northern California in the 1970s whose parents divorced. It tells us something about their lives. What it does not do is tell us if these outcomes are different for kids whose parents divorced than they would be for kids whose parents didn't divorce. So we don't know, we don't have any idea if any of this is related to the divorce or not. When Wallerstein writes up her results, or when she did, years ago for publication, this is an example of a paper she wrote at the 10-year follow-up. And it's actually full of very interesting and useful information about the subjective experience of kids whose parents divorce. What are their feelings and thoughts about the divorce? How are they approaching their own lives given their parents' divorce? All of that is very useful information. What it is not, however, and this is the book she wrote at the 25-year, after she collected data, 25 years after the divorce. What it cannot do, however, is the next step that Wallerstein took. She concluded that the divorce is what caused the pain and suffering and harm to those children. And because of the study design, that conclusion is sort of unwarranted. It's really good to know what's going on for them. But this design cannot establish correlation because we don't know what's going on with kids whose parents did not divorce. It cannot even establish the temporal order because we don't know anything about these kids before they divorced, except we have a hint that they were already suffering, and that's why they were referred to therapy. And it can't come anywhere near ruling out alternative explanations. I will point out that her work has come under some scrutiny because others have conducted research on the impact of divorce on children and pretty universally find that kids experience pain and then they recover pretty quickly. So her argument that divorce causes great harm to children contradicts much of what is known from all of the other published research in this field. I would conclude that the study itself provides useful empirical data about the subjective reality post-divorce for children. But the conclusion that those are causal, the conclusions about cause are simply not warranted and cannot be concluded from this particular study design, which lacks internal validity. A second form of quasi-experimental design with no control group is a little better. This is a simple interrupted time series. And essentially what the time series does is collect data at multiple pretest points and multiple post-test points. So it's a time series where the same variable has been measured many times. Something happened somewhere in the middle of it, so we can kind of see trends before the thing happened and trends in the outcome variable after that thing happened. But usually a simple interrupted time series does not have a control group. It can be used for testing the effect of things like laws and policies. I'll show you a famous example here related to HDFS is the impact, potentially the impact of the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation that babies should be placed to sleep on their back. Does that have an impact on the SIDS rate? And you can see the red bars there prior to the AAP recommendation. The SIDS rate produced about 3,000 infant deaths a year in the United States. The yellow lines are when the AAP was had made its recommendations, and the green bars show when the Back to Sleep campaign was being funded, and there were ads kind of everywhere, and doctors' offices had flyers about putting your baby on his or her back to sleep. And by the time you get to the green, the SIDS rate had dropped in half, down to 1,500 unexplained infant deaths per year. The blue line there is marking the percentage of parents who report that they put their baby to sleep either on their back or on their side. And so it appears that perhaps the Back to Sleep campaign got the message to parents. They responded by putting their baby on the back or on the side to sleep. And maybe as a result of that, the SIDS rate declined. Now, it's a little better than the quasi-experimental design with no control group that didn't even have a pretest. Here we have pretest, so we can actually say that there has been a change pre to post. Is it a causal relationship between the policy and the decreased SIDS rates? We can't really tell. It's a quasi-experimental design that has no control group. Please note that no control group would really be possible. Where would you find a control group? And it would have been completely unethical for the Back to Sleep campaign, let's say, to operate in 25 states and to not operate in 25 other states, even though we have lots of evidence that tummy sleeping is a risk factor for SIDS. That would have been unethical, couldn't have been done. So there's no possibility of a control group in this case. Still, with the multiple pre-tests and multiple post-tests, it's fairly compelling data, but it is not conclusive. Others have noted that at the same time you see that decline in SIDS deaths, there was also a decline in cigarette smoking in the United States. And so that's a third factor. We can't tell if it's the cigarette smoke, the declining rates of cigarette smoking that might be causing the decreased deaths, or if it's the Back to Sleep campaign. We still don't know. We cannot determine cause. But this is pretty suggestive. This is considered one of the most successful public health campaigns in the United States, potentially saving 1,500 infants' lives every year. Simple interrupted time series are also used for more personal things in individual people's lives. Can be used to describe the impact of a major life event on something that may or may not have already been changing but had already been tracked prior. Here's an example from a study that these are data from Germany, longitudinal data where the same people were surveyed once a year for at least 8 years. You can see graphed here on this chart. And what you see in the top line are people who got married, and they got married at that center line, 0 years. That's like the wedding, that's the year of the wedding. And this is their general life satisfaction. You can see that it peaks the year they get married. It's a pretty happy year for those folks. After the wedding, satisfaction declines a tiny bit. It seems to settle in higher than it was before the wedding. But in the bottom line, with the squares and the dotted line, you see folks who we know, because we kept collecting data for years after, we know they are going to divorce. When we look at what happens to them, their happiness does seem to increase until the year before the wedding. But kind of as soon as they got married, happiness starts to decline. It's lower than it was even before the graph started, and then it just keeps going down to a point that's quite a lot lower than it was to start with. To sum it up, I would say that single group quasi-experiments are good for providing descriptive information, process information, how things work, how that particular issue plays itself out. It's good for that sort of descriptive information, but single group quasi-experiments are not good for determining cause, and we should use extreme caution when we see these kind of data and want to infer cause from them.